You're listening to Drug Positive, the risk reduction and benefit enhancement podcast, reducing shame and stigma to save lives and end the drug war.
America's public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse. In order to fight and defeat this enemy, it is necessary to wage a new all-out offensive. This will be a worldwide offensive dealing with the problems of sources of supply as well as Americans who may be stationed abroad wherever they are in the world. In order to defeat this enemy, money will be provided to the extent that it is necessary and to the extent that it will be useful. Fundamentally, it is essential for the American people to be alerted to this danger, to recognize that it is a danger that will not pass with the passing of the war in Vietnam. One final word with regard to President.
That was Richard Nixon on June 17, 1971, the day he launched the so-called war on drugs. A war that has devastated millions of families around the world, where casualties from murder and violence vastly outnumber those from drug use itself. A war that has created ruthless cartels, destroyed entire communities, corrupted and undermined governments, militarized the police, and spawned a massive prison industrial complex, with more than 2 million people currently incarcerated. By any measure, the war on drugs produces incalculable death, misery, and suffering. And as we learned in 2016 from Nixon's domestic policy chief, John Ehrlichman, it was never about the drugs. Rather, it was designed specifically to imprison black people, civil rights activists, and the anti-war left. In other words, the drug war is really a war against us.
Forbes reports on a remark by a former Nixon aide hinting that the war on drugs had a hidden purpose, that President Nixon saw the drug crackdown as a way to arrest blacks and anti-war protesters. Ehrlichman also claimed that the White House knew they were lying about drugs.
So now here's Ehrlichman in his own words. We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities.
The blacks and the hippies, civil rights and anti-war activists? It bears repeating here. The so-called war on drugs is a war on people. It's never been about the risks and dangers of drug use. It's about imprisoning those of us working for a better world, for ourselves and others, those of us opposing war, corporate greed, the oppression of minorities, and the destruction of the environment. The people who work inside the institutions set up to fight the drug war, from the DEA to the National Institute on Drug Abuse to the White House Office of National Drug Control Policy, these people often rationalize the evil they are committing by pretending they're protecting children from the dangers of drugs. Some of them actually believe it, and we have to forgive them, for they know not what they do. But we must never forget the drug war is really a war against the good. And if we're going to end this war, we need to understand the strategies used to maintain it. Demonizing drugs, exaggerating their risks, and spreading falsehoods and disinformation about drugs is one strategy most people are familiar with. It's called propaganda, but because of the internet and the liberation of information, it's become much harder for them to convince people of their lies. Young people today can easily find out the truth about drugs online through sites like Arrowhead, Blue Light, Drugs Forum, DanceSafe, and many others. This is one reason we need to keep fighting for a free and open internet. But another, more subtle and more effective strategy they use against us, which is often used in war, is divide and conquer. Particularly, they divide us along lines of race and class, and the drugs we choose to use. For example, they falsely associate certain drugs, such as heroin, with blacks, Latinos, and poor people. Then they heavily target those communities, leaving white, privileged communities relatively free. This has the effect of silencing people within privileged communities who don't want to admit they use heroin or other opiates out of fear of being lumped in with the targeted communities, as well as psychedelic users within privileged communities who don't want the drugs they use to be lumped in with the more targeted drugs. In other words, the selective enforcement of drug laws against poor communities and communities of color results in a complacency among many white drug users, particularly white psychedelic users, including even many psychedelic advocates who won't participate in drug policy reform activism. So long as they have access to their source of preferred drugs, they don't want to take the risks. There's one prominent MDMA researcher, for example, who I've known for 20 years, and who I won't name, who refused to be interviewed for my documentary because he didn't want to be involved in anything with a political message. And there's an extremely popular psychedelic artist, and again I won't name names, who at first agreed to display some of his art at an event in DC organized by the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, but who then backed out after he learned that the event was a protest against the drug war and mass incarceration. It was a Burning Man-style event where we burned an effigy in front of the Washington Monument, revealing a metal prison cell inside. We did this to honor the hundreds of thousands of drug war prisoners currently incarcerated. And perhaps the most well-known psychedelic artist in the world, someone who even admits his own use of illegal drugs, refused to participate? This is the fear and complacency I'm referring to. A direct result of the racist enforcement of drug laws, the divide and conquer strategy they use to prevent us from uniting, black, white, poor or wealthy, in effective organizing to end this devastating war. But here's the thing. It's lessening. It's going away. Things are changing for the better fast, particularly among millennials and people born after the internet became a thing. These folks have much less fear, and they're much more enlightened on race and class issues. Most of the fear and complacency within the psychedelic community exists among people over age 50, and especially over 60. These are the folks who lived through the Nixon years when white psychedelic users were most heavily targeted. So while I'm critical of that generation's general lack of courage or understanding or solidarity or whatever it is that causes their hesitancy to engage in drug policy reform activism, I also understand their fear. We all have some fear. The drug warriors make sure of that. And to be very clear, I don't know the particular circumstances of any individual's life well enough to criticize them directly for their unwillingness to engage politically. All I know is that we need to engage politically, and that the more prominent a public figure you are, the more responsibility you have to make the right decision in that regard. We lead by example, after all. We need to end the drug war in its totality, whether or not we use any drugs. And the younger generation of psychedelic advocates are simply more willing, for whatever reason, to get involved. And that's why this episode is called The New Psychedelic Advocate, and why I chose to interview Ashley Booth, founder of the Aware Project, a Southern California-based psychedelic society that hosts a monthly speaker series and community discussions. She's also co-founder of Inner Space Integration, an organization helping people integrate past psychedelic experiences, part of a growing worldwide movement of psychedelic integration circles. Ashley is one of a number of young millennials today, including founders of new psychedelic organizations like Symposia, Psychedelics Today, and others who are examples of what I call the New Psychedelic Advocate. The New Psychedelic Advocate understands the race and class implications of the drug war and is not afraid to engage in politics. They understand the importance of solidarity with users of non-psychedelic drugs and the need for a harm reduction approach across the board. The New Psychedelic Advocate recognizes the need to end stigma, even for people with substance use disorders, and works towards the decriminalization and ultimate legal regulation of all drugs, for the sake of public health and fundamental human rights. They're also unafraid to call out problems within the psychedelic community itself, including sexual misconduct and assault that still takes place, paralleling the problems within our broader society. In short, the New Psychedelic Advocate has grown with the times and is more conscious, more politically and culturally enlightened than earlier generations. This is generally speaking, of course. There are also many enlightened elders in the psychedelic community, people who deserve our utmost respect and who we still can learn a great deal from. But in general, we need to support these younger activists. They're the new leaders, they're carrying the torch now, they understand our culture better, and they know what to do. We'll have more of them on this show over time. Okay, so this is our post-Burning Man show. We just got back a few days ago, and as some of you already know, we suffered some trauma. Tatiana got into a serious accident on the way there. The trailer she was pulling with all her art and all our Burning Man necessities jackknifed and slammed into the driver's side of the truck she was driving, totaling both the truck and the trailer. Miraculously, she got away with just a small head wound, which is crazy if you see what the truck looks like. I'm just so happy she's alive with no serious injuries. So after a night in the hospital with no truck or trailer or stuff, we decided to go to Burning Man anyway. After so much preparation, after Tatiana spent so many months on her Burning Man art, there's no way we could just not go. Physically, she was fine, but mentally, this is what she needed. So we packed an old tent we had, bought some new food, and headed out in our little Toyota with basically nothing. Now, anyone who's been to Burning Man knows just how much you really need to bring with you to survive in that harsh desert environment. And we hardly had anything we needed. But I made a Facebook post explaining what happened, and the outpouring of support we received was just incredible. Zendo Camp let us borrow 2 bicycles. People gave us lights, a shade structure, chapstick, goggles, dust masks. Everyone was so supportive, it was amazing. And we did have a great time. It was transformative and very healing, especially for Tatiana. We also launched a Facebook fundraiser to offset some of our costs due to the accident, and I just can't believe how many of our friends donated. I'm really humbled beyond belief. We feel so loved and appreciated. Even a few of you listeners out there who we've never met helped us out. So thank you. I really can't believe it. You're amazing, and we so appreciate you. And now, here she is. The best artist I've ever known. The most beautiful creature on the playa, the living and breathing love of my life, Tatiana.
That makes me cry.
Aww. I love you, baby.
Oh.
I really am so happy you're alive.
I'm so happy to be alive, too. Especially as time goes on and I start to go through the process of recovering from it, then the wonder at actually being alive is becoming more and more.
It's incredible.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, it was. It's been difficult, but also a real blessing.
It's been so moving to receive so many messages from friends and family, and to think about the people who care about me, and it's overwhelming. And I really want to thank everyone who has sent me good wishes and people who have donated.
Yeah.
I'm going to be writing to everyone. It's just taken a little time to arrive home and, as they say, decompress.
Yeah, major decompression this time.
Yeah. But thanks so much to everyone.
Yeah. So, interestingly, maybe you want to tell the listeners, Burning Man is largely about letting go and about loss, right? People burn their art that they worked on. It's a celebration of the ephemeral. And you didn't intend to burn your art, but you've had to let go now, right?
That's right, yeah, I have. And it's something that we've done. You've helped me work through it, and it's an important step forward in my life, in our relationship, in my art. It's really clarified and focused me. So from now on, I'm going to be focusing on my 2D art, and this is something that I was actually planning to do after Burning Man anyway, but without all the letting go, I still would have had this divided attention. Mm-hmm. And this way, I'm really clearing out the space to do my drawing and painting.
Your drawing and painting is incredible. Tatiana is an amazing fine artist. I mean, blows me away. She can do realism with perfect detail. She has got the skills of Salvador Dali. And her vision is bigger and better than Salvador Dali's. And I'm not just saying that because she's my wife. I'm going to start making prints. I've decided to be Tatiana's art manager. People need to see your art, baby. Everyone who does really loves it and is blown away by it. And I want to get your art out there.
Thank you, sweetie. Thank you. And I'm really fortunate to have you playing that role. That's something that a lot of artists need and want.
You're going to love this art, people. Wait till you see it.
So because of all of this, we had a very different Burning Man than we had expected.
It was definitely the best Burning Man I've.
It
was
was
my third, and I loved every minute of it.
It was my best. And one of the days that we spent together was really one of the best days of my life. Oh, God.
Yeah, it didn't start out that great, but then we did some LSD with a friend, someone that you recently met at Burning Man who had never taken LSD before. She is an artist also. She came from the UK. Her name is Amanda. Mm-hmm. And so we had a really good time riding around on our bikes on the playa, looking at the art while tripping.
Mm-hmm. And then we took MDMA together and we talked a lot. And I just remember sitting out at sunset with you, holding you, talking about our relationship and our lives. And then I looked over and I saw this piece of art that I could never find again, strangely. And it was this beautiful little sculpture of a bunch of kids in a circle with their arms around each other. They had backpacks on like school children, but they were larger than life. And they were huddled in a circle holding each other. And the warmth of that just really it just really got into my heart. And
wasn't that over by the trash fence?
I don't know. I was maybe disoriented because we had been riding all around and, I don't know.
Candy flipping.
Yeah. Candy flip is what that's called with LSD, then MDMA.
Some people take the MDMA first, but then, it wears off and you're still tripping. We took the MDMA 4 or 5 hours into the LSD experience, so they kind of tapered off together. Mm-hmm. But, we should tell people we also had some duds this year.
Yep.
We were given some San Pedro cactus paste by a friend who lives in Peru. And man, did he really talk this up. He was like, I live with this indigenous community and they grow San Pedro and they mix it with these other herbs and boil it down into this paste. And it's really incredible. And it was this black paste. It smelled really nice. And he was like, I'm going to give you 4 doses essentially. Like, you should just do this much, blah, blah, blah. So we didn't feel anything. 3 hours later, we took the other 2 doses. We doubled what he said. And we felt nothing. And we did this as the first thing we did because we didn't want to have down-regulated receptors by doing LSD first. This was the first drug we tried. We love mescaline. I think it's one of the most incredible psychedelics out there. To me, it's the psychedelic that feels the most like MDMA, but also has that visual component. And it didn't work at all. It was so disappointing. So I think we took 2CB later that night, and we did have a good time.
Yeah, that's right. That was a lot of fun. And 2CB is a shorter acting drug, so it was something that we could take, after much of the day had gone by already. Right.
We're kind of old school or just old, where we like day tripping and getting to bed at a reasonable hour. Mm-hmm. A lot of people will stay up till sunrise and try to sleep in the heat during the day, but
I'm a morning person anyway.
Mm-hmm. We also did some recording while we were out there because we are going to produce a podcast on drugs at Burning Man. And so we actually found out the rumors were true. The police were, in fact, heavily increasing their harassment of people coming in, including people from the Burning Man organization. So we're going to interview someone that knows a lot about this. And
because it may have actually been directed towards them, but we'll look into that.
Coming up in an upcoming episode.
So we love hearing from you guys, and thank you to those who have written us, and let's read a couple of those letters.
Okay, yeah, so this first is from Jim in Los Angeles, and he writes, Hi, Emanuel and Tatiana. Just wanted to send you a quick message and say I'm really enjoying the podcast. Some topics that I'd like to hear more about are 5-HTP and magnesium for MDMA users. Also, what's the most reliable yet affordable test kits? And finally, I'd love to hear from a person who's had their PTSD cured talk about their experiences in detail. Be well, and may your lives be filled with love.
Thank you. That's sweet.
Yes, thank you, Jim. Yeah, we can answer all of that. So 5-HTP magnesium for MDMA users. So I know for sure, I can tell you 100%, 5-HTP is a amino acid precursor to serotonin, and it will help you replenish your serotonin levels after you've taken MDMA. 5-HTP stands for 5-hydroxytryptophan, and serotonin is sometimes referred to as 5-HT, 5-hydroxytryptamine. There's just one enzyme called decarboxylase to convert 5-HTP into serotonin, 5-HT. The one thing I will say about 5-HTP, though, is you should not use it as a substitute for moderation. 5-HTP will make you recover from your MDMA experiences more quickly, but please don't then take MDMA more often. Remember, moderation is key, less is more. As for magnesium, people take magnesium because they claim it prevents or reduces the jaw clenching that can sometimes happen from MDMA. I've not personally experienced that, and there have been no studies that prove that. Tightness in the jaw muscles is very common with MDMA. It doesn't mean there's meth in it. It actually happens from MDMA, and it gets pretty bad if you take too high of a dose. But I don't doubt that it works for people. It might be placebo, and there might be some mechanism where magnesium reduces that.
If people have seen pictures of ravers with pacifiers in their mouths, that is something that came around because of the mouth action that MDMA causes.
I'm so glad that kind of faded away and is a relic of the 90s. I think it was for some people so they don't chew their lips, but also it was a back to childhood aesthetic, which I never really liked because pacifiers are not actually back to childhood. They're back to infancy. And I think that goes back a little too far.
Sometimes people will chew on a plastic toy or something. I actually have done that because I do tend to suck on my tongue or something like that. So
Right. Jim also asked about the most reliable yet affordable test kits. And, this is a question dear to me as the person who set up the first testing kit business in North America, turned that business over to the nonprofit when I resigned, DanceSafe, and we're still the only nonprofit selling testing kits. So I, really, for obvious reasons, recommend that you buy testing kits from DanceSafe, the original testing kits. We've been selling them for 20 years, and your money then gets put to harm reduction work.
So Jim also expressed an interest in hearing from people who have recovered from PTSD using MDMA, and we have a lot of material already.
Oh, yeah. We've interviewed a number of people who went through the MAP study talking about that for our documentary, MDMA the Movie. And we are going to be airing those interviews over time on the podcast. One of the things is I don't want this podcast to be just about MDMA. So we're trying to space out different episodes, but we'll get to it. You'll definitely hear. We have Rachel Hope, Nigel McCory, an Iraq veteran. Incredible, incredible stories. So just stick with us and you'll hear it. So we've got a great show for you now. It's about the role of millennials in the psychedelic movement. When I started DanceSafe back in 1998, I was 29 years old, and it was a very different environment back then. The internet had just came out, and so there really wasn't a lot of places to go to find accurate information or to talk about drug use. I know Arrowwood had just started, but the openness that we see now among people, especially young people, talking and engaging about drug use online just wasn't there yet. And harm reduction was still not yet broadly accepted. But today things have really changed, and I think the internet has played a ginormous role in that because there were no authorities about drugs. There was no one to go to get answers to your questions, right? Your teachers would not tell you the truth about drugs if they even knew. NIDA or the government websites were clearly lying to you. So there was a sort of hush-hush environment. You knew you shouldn't talk openly about drugs. But since the internet came out, I think young people have just grown up with open and honest conversations, and that has trickled out into the non-internet world. And young people like Ashley, who we interview in this podcast, are fearless. They're open. They're out. They're the new psychedelic advocate.
And the nature of the internet is that people can find their own people, their own little niche, their corner of the internet where like-minded people hang out. And so that's allowed communities to develop. And also, we need to give a lot of credit and respect to the early pot activists back in the day. Like I remember in the 90s when you were starting Dance Safe, I at that point had never even heard the word harm reduction. But I remember the pot legalization activists were sort of old timers, a lot of them from the 60s and 70s. They were very ragtag, there was a playful activism like the Yippies and the Cacophony Society that started Burning Man. There was this sort of wildness in the air that carried through to the pot activism. And I went on a few of those marches, these bearded, old timers with banners, smoking joints on the steps of the Capitol or the courthouse or whatever they were doing. They were just pushing the envelope and just continuing. And at the time, almost seemed futile or
some of them went to jail for it.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. And other people who were really compassionate caretakers. Brownie Mary is a famous name, who would bring pot brownies to AIDS patients back then.
Yeah, we're standing on their shoulders.
Yeah, it's really important to honor those early activists and keep the history alive.
Yeah, absolutely. Hey, I think Krishna is scratching at the door.
Okay, yes, he is.
Let him in.
Oh, it's Velvet. Come on in, kitty. Now she's just lying there. Come on in. Meow.
Well, okay, so you listened to the interview with Ashley. What did you think? Any parts stand out?
Well, I really appreciate the discussion about power dynamics, social interactions, race, and sexual abuse that can potentially be a factor in any community.
Right. I mean, again, it's millennials talk about this, right? It's out there now. Our generation didn't really speak of that kind of stuff when we were younger, consent and all of that. It was really began in the 80s. So
by continuing to bring up these conversations, it makes the space available for anyone to step into if there is a problem happening for them. And it also helps everyone to understand that these issues are present in all of our lives and it permeates all communities and all levels of society. We don't have to feel that if we're talking about it, it's because there's a problem or anything like that. It's just a natural part of being a group and being a community, right. And it's something to be aware of. So they are integrating these values into our culture, and we have a big thanks to them for that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so, gender issues and sexual misconduct and assault within the community, that's one issue, and Ashley and others are dealing with that. The other one is race and privilege. And that issue is often more difficult for people to deal with because the issue of privilege often brings about feelings of guilt. We have to recognize as white people that we have privilege in a racist culture. But unless we know what to do about that, we can just stew on it, right? I mean, what do you do? And having been an activist for so many years and been trained by elders in issues of race and privilege, I can tell you the number one takeaway that people of color activists say that us white people need to do is use our privilege to make change. Work towards a better society. And so work to end the drug war.
That was the origin of this modern drug war, right? You have a quote at the beginning of this show from Nixon. In the very beginning, that was his intention, to attack the blacks and the hippies.
Right. Yeah, so get involved. There's a lot of organizations out there. Drug Policy Alliance, Harm Reduction Coalition, Dance Safe, Students for Sensible Drug Policy, Families for Sensible Drug Policy, Moms United to End the War on Drugs. If you're in the UK, Transform, one of my favorite drug policy reform organizations out there, Transform. Get involved. More important than donating money is to actually join them, do some work.
And it's fun.
It's very fun.
It's fun to volunteer with Dance Safe. You get to know great people. You get to go to festivals.
And we're making progress on the front of drug policy reform. I mean, look, how long has Trump and Sessions been in power now? Almost 2 years? They haven't been able to make a dent in the cultural change that's been going on. Hey, let's be clear, though. Arrests for marijuana among communities of color, even in the states where it's been legalized, has increased. White people are getting arrested less frequently since legalization, but black people are getting arrested more. So the racism is still there. The drug war is still going on. We're making progress, but let's not fool ourselves. We still need to get involved. We still need to keep pushing.
This is actually a typical way to be able to, for the powers that be to be able to continue oppression, is by releasing pressure on the privileged folks, and then they become complacent.
Yes, the divide and conquer strategy.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Anything else in the interview?
What a beautiful description of her first 5-MeO DMT experience.
Oh, yeah, right.
Yeah. These experiences that people have, they happen on a level where it registers as real for the person that's going through this experience. We can hear her describing it, and we can hear it as an idea or a concept.
Wait, stop right there.
Yeah.
Registers as real? Why wouldn't it be real?
It is to the person who's you are going through a real experience.
Yeah, like I like to say, there's nothing less real about an experience while you're on drugs than when you're not on drugs.
Right. And it's involving every part of yourself, and you are in it, you are living it, and it changes you. And it transformed her life.
Yeah, right. In a really positive way. Her first 5-MeO DMT experience led her to become the activist that she is right now. And what really struck me is when she said that she afterwards, because she had this authentic spiritual awakening, which so positively transformed her life, she realized this drug is illegal, that there are people trying to prevent us from having these authentic spiritual experiences. And, how criminal is that? How tragic is that? So now she's devoted her life to helping re-legalize these substances and get these medicines out to people. Beautiful, beautiful. Love the millennials. Love you, Ashley. Can't wait for everyone to hear your interview.
Yeah, thanks so much for all the good work that you're doing in the world.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so what's the harm reduction tip?
Well, we already talked about 5-HTP and magnesium for MDMA users, so maybe we leave it at that, except one really important harm reduction tip I want to give people, and that is, please do not overload your trailer.
Consider not even pulling a trailer.
Yeah, we're done with trailers. We've joined there's an entire Burning Man contingent of people who will never drive trailers again. We found out Tatiana is not the first one by far to crash a trailer pulling her art to Burning Man. In fact, someone we met there says they're going to bring a piece of art next year, like of a
trailer hitch.
A trailer hitch.
Yeah.
That's right. Say goodbye to the trailer hitch. Rent a big truck. It's way safer than pulling a trailer. That's our harm reduction advice for today. All right, well, let's get to the interview. Here is Ashley Booth from the Aware Project.
Bye, everyone. Enjoy.
Ashley, thank you for being on the show.
Yeah, happy to be here.
It's really great to have you. I've always been really impressed with you millennials. There's so many new organizations out there, not just yours, but Symposia, Psychedelics Today, etc. It seems like your generation lacks the fear that our generation had in coming out of the closet.
Mm-hmm.
So I just want to thank you for starting the project. Why don't we begin by you telling our listeners about the Aware Project? What is it you do?
Yeah, so about 3.5 years ago, I started a psychedelic society here in Southern California.
Mm-hmm.
So we have events in Los Angeles and San Diego. And we've been doing events either 2 to 3 times a month in those different locations and bringing in speakers from...
I was one of the speakers you brought.
You were, and that was one of our best talks. So it was
thanks. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
But you do more than that, right? More than just these.
I do, yeah. I also co-founded an integration support program for people that have had big experiences with psychedelics or are planning to have some kind of journey but need a little bit of safety support and just good practices.
Integration is so important. How do you find people for that? Like, how do people come across it and join the integration circles?
As participants?
Yeah.
Well, it's mostly through our network, through the Aware Project. So we have like one mailer, and then that goes out to our whole community, and we have several thousand people on the mailing list now. So we kind of cross-promote that way.
Right. It seems like it's more important to get people into integration circles who aren't so well connected with the psychedelic community. So many people out there just tripping kind of unconsciously.
Yeah, we use Meetup, which gets a broader audience, for our events as well. But we also go to a party or something that's either there are a lot of people that use psychedelics there, or if it's psychedelically themed, and they'll give out flyers and stuff just to try and get a broader audience of maybe people that are using it in a maybe recreational way.
Yeah. I like to say that recreational drug use literally means recreational drug use. And so there's nothing wrong with that. We recreate ourselves with psychedelics. It's a good way to do it.
For sure. Yeah. And I really liked, I think I heard a podcast with Rick Doblin from MAPS, and he said instead of using the word recreational, using the word celebratory.
That's right.
Which, I think I still kind of use the word recreational if it's in the context of maybe an escape. But I like the phrase celebratory use if it's more for a celebration of life, and it's maybe you're not doing soul searching work, but you're being present and you're enjoying being alive with other beautiful people.
Right. Yeah, I remember Rick told me the same thing too. I like using recreational. I like reclaiming the original meaning of words. But, here and there, the problem is that recreational drug use has a vernacular connotation that we just can't really easily shake off, meaning sort of self-destructive or abusive use, that kind of thing. Yeah. I'm a radical, though. I like pushing the envelope.
Yeah. Well, I think come to think of it, too, there's sort of a connotation of frivolity, I think, with it. And for a culture that's so focused on productivity and keeping your nose to the grindstone, I could see how...
God forbid we relax, huh?
Right, exactly. I had a cannabis experience once where I think the more conscious I become in my use of different substances, I feel like I connect to them in a different kind of way. And over the last couple of years, my relationship to cannabis has changed. And I kind of realized I had this moment where I was like, I could feel that the plant was sort of teaching me how to be in my body, because cannabis is so good for that, because it's like eating feels so good, dancing feels amazing, making love it feels amazing, going for walks, you're in your body. And the way that I had tried to use cannabis before that was doing it and then doing what I always do, which is either engaging with people in conversation or trying to think in the normal way that I was thinking. And it all turned upside down. And I kind of realized that the cannabis was trying to say hey, stupid monkey, stop using your brain so much and just relax and be in your body. It's really awesome to have a body.
Yeah. Cannabis is really interesting that way. I only use cannabis late at night, very infrequently, because I think like you, I can't be productive and work on it. It just it tells me nope. But I know people who smoke cannabis all day long, and to be honest, I would rather be around them when they've smoked than when they haven't smoked. So, we have to remember drugs affect people very differently.
Yeah, and I think well, also for me, it's also developing a relationship with it too, and figuring out, because I can work on it as well if I'm by myself. Mm-hmm. But it's sort of building a relationship, making sure that you're having a right relationship with it.
Yeah, and that's the key thing, that's the language we need to be using. What relationship do you have with a given drug? Harm reduction should be using this, not just with psychedelics, but with any drug. What happens is when we use drugs unconsciously, and of course prohibition and the drug war manifests that kind of unconscious use, we develop unhealthy relationships to various drugs.
Yeah, well, I think that's across the board in our kind of modern culture is not having a balance, because if you're imbalanced within yourself, the way that you interface with the world is going to be imbalanced.
Yeah. All right. So anything else besides your events in Los Angeles and your integration circles? Anything else the Aware Project does?
The new series that we've started up, and we're still kind of seeing what form it takes, is psychedelic community discussions. And so our first one, we were talking around issues having to do with gender, sexuality, and power within the psychedelic community.
Very important, yeah.
Yeah, and it's kind of come up in interesting sorts of ways in the community across the country, as well as, an ongoing problem of occasional abuse by providers. And so Even though I've been in, the activism world for only a few years, it's already been so fascinating to see how much has changed over that time. And I think as we get bigger and more people get activated and participate in the community, we see more of the shadow aspect of our psyches coming through. And just because we've had a lot of experiences that have maybe enlightened us to different aspects of who we are, we're still the product of the culture that we live in. And just because you can take some psychedelics and have some deep experiences doesn't turn all of that social programming off.
Right.
And so I think it still takes a lot of presence to continue to question how we're even approaching the work and the privileges that we have in moving through the work. So, what kinds of issues around sexuality and the abuse of power are already seen in the community in different ways, and how do we start to address that head on so that we're coming up with solutions as a community? It was a really beautiful discussion. We have the whole thing on YouTube, so if anyone wants to go check it out, I really recommend, because we had a couple of panelists talk about different issues related to these things. And then we opened it up for a discussion with the community to kind of brainstorm, like, how do we handle when there's an abuse of power, by maybe an underground provider? Because, you can't go through the same channels as above ground.
Yeah, right. What recourse do you have?
Right. And so how, as a community, do we keep each other safe and hold ourselves to a high standard? And I think some of the suggestions that came out of that were really valuable. And
people can watch it on your YouTube channel then? Just go
correct.
to YouTube and search for Aware Project?
Yeah. It came out really well. And then the second discussion we had a month later was around issues of diversity, race, and privilege within the psychedelic community.
So important. That's one of my questions I have here I wanted to ask you about. Go ahead. Tell me what happened.
Yeah, so it was a great discussion. We had other community leaders that kind of led us in, and then we had a good discussion with the community. And I think it's naming often the elephant in the room. And for some people, if you're living a life where you live in a privileged bubble most of the time, which, I would say that a lot of us that are interested in psychedelics tend to be people that are privileged because we have a layer of protection.
Or at least those of us who have come out of the closet and are speaking publicly about it are part of the privileged community, because that's what enables us to come out.
Yeah.
And there's nothing wrong with that. We all need to come out, but we need to understand that not everyone is free to do that.
For sure, yeah. And just being able to have this be part of our active conversation so it's present in everyone's mind. And something that came up for me too, and I'm in grad school right now to become a therapist, and I'm doing a social work program, which is obviously very social work oriented and has a lot of education around communities that are underserved and the policies and the issues that keep people in those cycles. And so part of what I've kind of learned in the education that I'm getting through that program is, there are a lot of people that have been thinking about these things for a very long time, and we don't need to recreate the wheel. We just need to merge the different bubbles around social change and social justice with what we're doing, because both communities are edge pushers.
Right.
And when we can work together and learn from each other, we're obviously going to make a stronger community overall.
Yeah. Well, let's be clear. We need to end the drug war. For multiple reasons, we need to end the drug war to allow psychedelic users the civil rights to obtain their medicines and these beneficial substances. And we also need to end the drug war because it's racist and it's been used to jail minorities. And so, we don't need to reinvent the wheel. We all have to come together and get on the same page.
Yeah.
And I've always said, and part of the mission of this podcast is to move forward, not just the conversation, but the policy. And I think the next step is decriminalization, the decriminalization of all drugs. I think we need state-by-state initiatives to do that. The public supports it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a health issue, and it kind of goes
It's a health issue and it's a justice issue. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, essentially you're blaming the victim of a system that keep people in the cycle.
Right. So let me ask you, you've become a bit high profile. Do you take precautions? Are you concerned about being targeted for your advocacy?
I wouldn't say no. I mean, I definitely had a really solid sit down with myself before embarking on this more vocal advocacy path. And just, had a couple of long nights just thinking about, okay, what are the possible consequences of doing this? I mean, I think there are many more of the, kind of younger generation now that are stepping into these roles. I think we're also kind of have some level of protection in terms of a herd or a swarm or a school of fish, because there's so many of us now that are, that are coming on and being vocal.
Right.
It's a little bit harder, I think, for someone to kind of target individual people. But I mean, I'm obviously don't, not being stupid, but
right.
We have the freedom of speech. And so, I tell people when they come to our events, we encourage people to share their experiences, but please don't talk about buying, selling, or making or seek out people at these events because
Right.
you're jeopardizing the safety of the space. It's a public space. We don't know if they're undercover cops or informants that are in the space. And we are still living in the age of prohibition,
Right.
even if we're having more freedoms. And I think as the culture gets more open, with cannabis and now with so much talk in the media around the MDMA work, the research and Michael Pollan's book, it's just people now, they're hearing about it.
Right. I've been in this world now for over 20 years, and I also had a heart-to-heart conversation with myself, particularly because I have always, from the start, criticized prohibition. Harm reduction is putting Band-Aids on a problem that will never be solved until we end the drug war. You don't need a testing kit to check to make sure your beer is not poisoned, for example. And so I've been really out about it and kind of wondered, or am I going to be targeted? And, we did have 2 DEA agents visit us in the National Dance Safe office back in 1999. And also, Dance Safe really quickly became popular. We got tons of media right away. And, I think at that point, it sort of became impossible. If there was anyone in the DEA that wanted to crack down, they would have had a political disaster on their hand to crack down on a harm reduction organization. But what you're doing isn't as much harm or risk reduction as it is advocacy for, in some ways, breaking the law. So does that make you nervous?
Well, I generally don't phrase it that way. I mean, I would say education on benefits and risks. I went to an event last night, was giving out some flyers, and there were 2 19-year-old girls that I gave a flyer to. I didn't realize they were quite that young, but they had all sorts of questions. They're like, oh, we're thinking about doing mushrooms, but the only people we know around here have done mushrooms like once or twice, and they're like, now are the only experts that we know. I was thinking, oh Jesus,
is 19 too young?
Well, she was. I mean, I don't have any.
Most people start experimenting with psychedelics at 14 or even 13.
Yeah, which I don't know if I agree with that.
How old were you? How old were you when you first took a psychedelic?
I was out of college.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I had done cannabis before that, but I hadn't done any.
Right.
No, that's not true. I did some mushrooms in college, but they were very mild.
I like to say I feel privileged that I came across MDMA when I was 16 years old and was able to use it to heal from my childhood trauma for precisely the reason that a lot of the anti-drug folks say young people shouldn't use drugs. And that's because at that age, your brain has more plasticity. It hasn't solidified in its patterns. And I really hated myself. I was really angry over what happened to me, et cetera. And, I don't know if I would be the same person today if I didn't take MDMA multiple times when I was a teenager.
That's a really interesting perspective. I mean, because I've always felt like I encountered them at a really good time for me because I had sort of processed through a lot of things and then felt like when I finally reached them, I was in a place where I could have a responsible relationship with it. I mean, when I was this past year at my social work program, my internship was doing school counseling at a high school, and high school students, teenagers, like their brains are just wired differently at that age. So, I mean, I could see how it could be really helpful to help change, some like giving a different perspective while the brains are still plastic, but, their higher level of risk that they, if someone was being supported by, I don't know. I mean,
it's all about intention. It's all about setting and dose. And, there are many teenagers who have good support groups around them and who use psychedelics very, very positive. I mean, you can see that at at festivals.
For sure, yeah. So, I think
Sorry, you're talking with a radical here. I don't mean to make you uncomfortable saying teenagers should use psychedelics, but I think that's when they start using. We don't have any control over that. We get criticized for condoning drug use. We're not in any position to condone or condemn drug use. Drug use is happening. It's happening by people of all ages.
Right.
I mean, not all ages. It starts in middle school. That's when it starts. And at that point, people need to be educated.
Yeah, exactly. So, I can project what I would like to see in sort of an ideal entheogenic using culture, but how we get there is, a very different matter. And it takes a lot of...
So that's interesting. You use the term entheogenic. That kind of has a religious or spiritual connotation. Entheos meaning God. Tell me, do psychedelics for you have a spiritual component?
For sure. Yeah. I mean, that's why I'm so impassioned about them, because they were the thing that sparked that connection to something bigger than myself.
Right. And, I noticed you had a 5-MeO DMT necklace on. And of course, that's like the granddaddy of spiritual psychedelics.
It was the one that started the whole journey I'm on right now. So,
Was it the first psychedelic that you ever took?
No. I've been doing psychedelics since Burning Man, so 11 years ago, and then about 5 years ago, I got into more plant spiritual kind of contextual use. I got introduced to ayahuasca, and then shortly after that, had a 5-MeO experience, and that just completely.
Tell me about it. Describe it. You must have told this story before. I want to hear it. Ashley's first 5-MeO experience. What was it like?
I try and tap back into the feeling when I tell people, because otherwise it just becomes words.
Ashley, are you there? Hello, Ashley.
Yeah, exactly. So I guess to give a bit of context, I had been a raised kind of Christmas, Easter Christian.
Okay.
And then, we went to church like once a year or something like that. And then when I got into middle school, I was like, I don't believe in this. And so I don't want to go to church. And then my whole family's like, okay, whatever. And so we all stopped going. And I would say my parents are actually more atheists. And I think that they were just thinking that the church was, I don't know, what you're supposed to do.
I think a lot of times when people have children, they sort of rekindle the way their parents raised them, thinking, oh, this is how you be responsible.
Yeah, it's a little odd. But, both my dad's an electrical engineer, my mom was a mathematician and in finance. So they're very analytical-based people. And my previous career before embarking on this path was as an environmental scientist. So I spent most of my life, and a lot of my earlier, high school, college, being a pretty adamant atheist. And then when I started doing psychedelics after college, I became more of an agnostic, I would say, just kind of in wonderment of whatever the heck was going on here.
Psychedelics can do that to you.
And then I had an opportunity to do 5-MeO with a very responsible facilitator that puts a really safe and spiritual context around the experience and with good preparation. And I didn't really have any fear going into the experience. It was interesting, though, because it took me a couple of rounds of re-ups. I had to re-up twice.
They started you out small.
Yeah, no, I would say around average.
Okay.
And then I had 2 ups after that because I was still present. And so I asked for more. And finally on the third round, broke into a full release experience. And my heart was open, and it was as if this voice was talking to my heart. And it saw that my heart had a question. And the question was, is there a God? And this consciousness answered me, and it said yes. And it filled me with so much love and compassion that I came out of that experience weeping with gratitude and just so much love just pouring out of me. And for the next several months, I just had a lot of emotional release. Half the time when I would go into Savasana when I do yoga, I would start crying because it was just like such a radically different perspective to look at the world and at myself. And it was such a real experience that it was a knowing that was not coming from my head. It was a knowing that was coming from my heart and from my body. And
right. Beautiful. Wow, what a beautiful story. Keep going, keep going.
Yeah, and it took me a year and a half, and the rest of my life really, but that first year and a half was, a lot of integration work to be able to see the world from this completely radically different perspective. And part of when I came out of that experience, I felt like this is a crime against humanity that this medicine isn't available to people should they want to have this experience. An authentic spiritual mystical experience, and it's illegal. It was like it offended the core of my being. And at the same time, brings with me a level of compassion for how the world is the way that it is and why it is the way that it is, but also lit an even stronger fire within me to improve the lives of all the beings on this planet.
Great. Okay, so what does it mean for you now that you realized God? What does God mean for you? Is it a different conception of God than the traditional one?
Yeah. I mean, the word God was definitely what came through. Other people call it different things, but that was the word, and I just sort of reclaimed it for myself.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't say that I have faith, because I see the definition of faith as believing in something when you have no proof.
The issue of proof when it comes to these spiritual questions, I think, is different from a scientific proof because they're inner experiences. Yeah. You had an inner subjective experience that has convinced you of something that, it's not faith in the blind faith. It's faith in the sense of you can't convince somebody else.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think in the Upanishads, they say the realization is so strong, it's like the knowledge of having a fruit in the palm of your hand. You know it's true, just like you're holding that apple and it's right there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. There's something beautiful about that as well, because it's almost like language. No matter how eloquent someone is in sharing a story about an experience, you cannot, by listening to that story, have all of the details as if you've experienced it yourself. Mm-hmm. And so in the way that our brains are structured, we can't mind meld, So the only way we can have an experience and to grok it fully is by having it ourselves.
Right.
And every person is on their own personal journey to have whatever experiences they're going to have. And so, my words of my story might inspire someone, but it's not going to replace the experience within themselves.
Of course, of course. So let me ask you this. How do you know that the voice that spoke to you wasn't an alien? Because there's a lot of people who smoke DMT and then have these beliefs that we're just a simulation in a society of aliens who have created us. It's like they're interpreting this experience from the cultural context of today. I have this kind of ongoing tongue-in-cheek debate with Mitchell Gomez, the current executive director of DMSafe. Because he kind of buys into the whole simulation thing, and I tell him, well, that's just an infinite regress. Because if you think that the beings that speak to you are aliens in another civilization, we're just a simulation. Well, maybe they're just a simulation of a society of aliens above them, and then it goes on and on and on forever, and that's like illogical when you think about it. But, when I had my first 5-MeO DMT experience too, it was profound and I got spoken to, and there was no denial to me that whatever it was that was speaking to me was an all-knowing being, at least knew everything about me, the things that I wasn't even aware of about myself, right? So in a lot of ways, these discussions are moot, like the medicines teach you things as however you interpret them is up to you, right?
Yeah, I mean, we definitely all have our cultural lens, and, and that's something that's kind of an ongoing conversation, I think, in the community too, because it's like, wait, there are people that do psychedelics and still do bad things. Like, so it's not just like this panacea that just teaches people about God, Right. So, these are all things that are tools as far as, is this a simulation? Is this the, the God that I'm somehow interfacing with? I don't know, but I think that the deeper truth that felt like was conveyed to me was that the foundational vibration of the universe is love.
Right.
And that felt like the most important part. And while there are many things in life that do not feel like love, I think that is the thing that is the balm to our searching souls.
Uh-huh. Well, a lot of people will replace the term God with higher self. Even 12-step does that, but we're not going to go there. The point being, though, this concept of God doesn't have to be understood as a being separate from you. We all have a conscience. There's a higher self in us that we know. We all know when we're doing things we shouldn't be doing, when we're being selfish or not. And so anyone can have an experience of communicating with their higher self. I've got a running dialogue in my head all the time. And when I'm sort of thinking of what's the moral, ethical thing to do in this situation, in a way that's sort of having a conversation with God.
No matter where it's coming from, if it resonates with you, great, take it.
That's the ultimate takeaway. That's exactly right. Truth is truth. Take what is true and leave what is false.
Yeah, or just doesn't serve you because, according to you, it's false, but maybe to someone else, it feels like truth.
Yeah, I like to say that I think atheists believe in God more than a lot of the rest of us do because they have such a certain conception of what God is. Man with a white beard in the sky in heaven, and they're knocking it down like a straw man, right? Oh, I don't believe in that. And so they have pride in their certainty that doesn't exist, but their minds are not open to other conceptions of how that word might be used, or that in other languages, Brahman, for example, it's a different concept entirely.
Yeah, I mean, it's to continue to engage in the conversation, and it's a much more interesting way to live. And
we just got to give them all 5-MeO-DMT, then they'll see the light, right?
Yeah, well, yeah.
We should get back to drugs. This is great. I love the conversation we've had. To get a podcast. There's freedom. We can go down any road we want, but. All right, so you have a very spiritual perspective around psychedelics. You use the phrase entheogen, right? Many people don't, though. Here we've been talking about a lot of atheists out there who they can also benefit from psychedelics, even though they may never have a spiritual perspective on them.
Correct. Yeah. I mean, there are many ways to interface with these drugs. I would say that more often than not, people kind of end up having an accidental spiritual experience at some point in their psychedelic career, whether they intend to or not.
Right.
So, I mean, that's sort of an interesting phenomenon in itself, and that different types of substances elicit different kinds of experiences. I mean, the way I kind of reconcile it with myself is just to revel in the mystery and the wonderment of it all, because I mean, that even before I had a spiritual, mystical experience, I was having wondrous experiences, being out at Burning Man at sunrise, on some acid, and just being taken to my knees in tears and wonderment at the beauty of everything that was around me.
Right. So what's next for the Aware Project then? What do you have coming down the line?
Continuing to develop our community discussions. We're consistently bringing in really great speakers. We're having someone that's doing a documentary series on the Shulgins on the 21st, and then we're inviting Paul Austin from the Third Wave to talk about microdosing in early September.
Oh, I love threshold doses of LSD, like 30 mics, just where things become a little brighter.
A little sparkly on the edges.
Oh, there was one thing I wanted to talk to you about, I remember. I noticed that the Aware Project does an event every year on Bicycle Day. So tell me, do you really believe that Albert Hofmann discovered LSD accidentally in the way he describes?
I mean, I
or it's just a myth.
I mean, I guess the way I operate in the beliefs that I sort of move off of is that I think it is, but maybe how those serendipitous happenstances came to pass might be a little bit more spiritually driven, and Albert Hofmann had some pretty early mystical type experiences.
Yeah, so what was he doing experimenting with indoles and accidentally spills some on himself and then writes this description with glowing reports of the beauty of it. It just comes across like he was really trying to promote it, right? If he was just an objective scientist, spill some LSD on him and started freaking tripping out, there would have been an element of fear involved, and it could have been a very scary trip. And then the first report of LSD would have been like, demons attacked me on my bicycle. And there's always been something that didn't ring true about that story to me.
Well, I mean, my understanding of the story was that it was a very challenging experience for himself because he started feeling the effects of it while he was still in his lab, and then, was escorted home on his bicycle, hence the name Bicycle Day, back to his home. And he thought he had poisoned himself and was dying. And so he invited a doctor to come over to the house to see if he was okay. And they checked him out, and besides his eyes being very dilated, they couldn't really find anything wrong with him. And so I think that helped him relax a little bit. And then as he was able to relax, the tail end of his experience was very beautiful. I mean, the part that is a little bit strange, and how did a scientist get chemical on him? How can you even absorb LSD through your skin?
Right,
and
right.
even if you use what's that called? It's some kind of
DMSO.
DMSO, yeah, on your skin to make it more porous. Still, you can't trip from that. And I was like, okay, well, back in the day, they used to pipette things with their mouths, and so maybe somehow they didn't bring the liquid all the way into your mouth, but you would use it to pipette with the suction of your mouth. And so maybe he got a little bit in him that way. But the thing is that standard chemical practices, if you're working with material that, you don't know if it's a poison or not, you'd think you'd make particular types of precautions. But
Right.
because it is active, it's such small amounts that maybe even if you had a poison that you got a little tiny bit on you, in those kind of levels, it wouldn't affect you. But because this was so powerful at such small amounts that maybe standard chemical practice isn't accounting for such small amounts,
There's a lot of questions in this.
Yeah, we're never going to know. So I don't even know if I feel comfortable postulating about it.
Have you heard the theory that Hoffman was a part of a German secret society who had been using psychedelics, including LSD, for a long time and decided to release it to the world during World War II because they were fearful of humanity ending civilization? And they said, we need to get these medicines out there. Have you heard that theory?
No.
It's been written about.
Not.
It's been written about.
There have been a lot of things that have been
Well, that's true.
I mean, unless we find more proof, I'm not sure what the use in conjuring up,
Well, the nature of secret societies is that, they keep things a secret. This was an intentional way they could release it to the world without revealing themselves. Albert Hoffman played the role of doing it.
I think we as a psychedelic culture, I think we have to be very careful as we postulate about these things, because also, I mean, we need to be careful ambassadors of what it is that we're bringing forth, and being sure that we're bringing forth good information, with science or the theories that we have around the historical use of these things. Because if we are standing on stretched thin ground and thin ice with a lot of conspiracy theories.
Oh, that's a good point. I love the German secret society conspiracy theory, though. I'm not saying I know it's true.
Yeah, but are we? How can we be the best ambassadors for this work so that we gain credibility, so that we can end the drug war
that theory isn't a negative one, though. That theory states that there were some people who were concerned about the future of humanity, recognized that these substances have value, and released them to the world. Right?
For sure, yeah, and I mean that is but I think it's more of how we conduct. How do we conduct ourselves so that we're being critically minded? If someone tells me again that DMT is released when people die or when people are born, I'm gonna because that
wasn't that in the film DMT, the Spirit Molecule?
Well, so it's in Rick Strassman's book, DMT, the Spirit Molecule. And in the beginning, he postulates that it was made in the pineal gland and that maybe it was released during death and birth. But the thing is, then we get through this process of the telephone game, and the part about the hypothesis doesn't get taken through. So many people who have not read this book don't know that it was just a hypothesis. And how would you even, it's a really good question to ask. How would science know if DMT was released at birth and death the only way you could do that is if at the moment of birth you take a baby,
cut their pineal gland out,
you flash freeze their brain somehow. It's like, how would you even do that? I mean, not to say that it couldn't be happen, but like that the science is just in its nascent phase at this point. So we just need to be really careful about the stories that and the lore that we propagate, even when we're hearing it from other not
clearly that DMT story is just a story. I think what happens is, people take DMT and they have an ego death experience. And so it reminds them, they think, oh, this must be what happens when you die, when your ego goes away.
Yeah, I mean, you could argue a whole bunch of things. I mean, not to say that all these ideas and ways to postulate, I mean, that's how science begins, is when we have theories around things, and then you have to come about the process of trying to prove it, and unfortunately, because these things elicit experiences that are so subjective, it makes it really hard to practice science in the same sorts of ways. It's a slow process,
Right.
And we just have to be patient.
Well, Ashley, you are an excellent ambassador for these substances. You are very clear thinking, you're scientific minded, and you have a spiritual perspective, and there's harmony between all those sides of you. So I appreciate you and want to thank you once again for what you do, and wish you the best success as a psychedelic therapist, and hope that you continue to have the time to be an activist for the cause through even through your professional career.
Yeah, I think my career is going to go for quite a long time. This is just scratching the surface. So thank you so much. I really enjoyed our conversation.
You're welcome. Thank you for coming on. We'll definitely have you on again at some point on the show.